All right, perfect. We are going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone, and thank you all for being here today for our first ever showcase that's not on Friday. I'm really sorry for those of you who joined us on Friday and had to witness the very unfortunate incident of Zoom bombing. We have made some changes to our Zoom room to prevent this from happening today and in future events. And a huge shout out to Dan for being so flexible and willing to reschedule for today. So with that being said, my name is Maddie Mitchell, and I am the Director of the Council of Sustainable Leaders. We host this weekly series to present the various aspects of sustainability, which is framed around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. In a time of chaos, instability, and anxiety, it is especially important to stay connected with a consistent community like this one. If you have a question throughout the talk, feel free to send it to me in the chat or to the general chat. Otherwise, we'll have time after Dan's talk for you to personally ask questions through the raise hand function, or you can continue putting them through the chat. Also, if you're watching today with family or friends or pets or anything, I encourage you to take a photo and email it to us so we can share it on social media how you're staying connected. Additionally, if you aren't on our weekly newsletter and would like to be added, you can send me your email via the chat privately or, of course, in the general function as well. So with that being said, today we have Dan Bena, who is the former head of sustainable development for global operations for PepsiCo. He also wants to be known that above any of his credentials, he loves his wife, family, and animals. Dan will be speaking about business and the SDGs. Is it all just talk? Without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Dan.
Thanks, Maddie, and thanks, Professor Goodstein, for this opportunity. Thanks, everybody that's taking time to call in. I wanted to start just with a brief explanation of the photo that you see on the slide, because I think it's kind of more appropriate than ever to tell you the story behind it. I was on a very small plane on my way back from Chicago to New York, and we flew through a pretty horrific thunderstorm. And I'm kind of a worrier at heart, so I was never saying so many prayers and Hail Marys as I've said in that short amount of time, flying through those clouds. But we did fly through the clouds, and this is what emerged. And I just took this picture with my iPhone. And it was just kind of remarkable when people say the silver lining around the clouds, and this maybe looks a little bit more like a gold lining. But I thought that, you know, we emerged from the storm, and there were absolutely better skies and better days ahead. And I think that's particularly pertinent to this massive pandemic that we're facing as humanity today. It's hard to believe that there actually will be an emergence from it, but I believe that there will be, and I have to believe that there will be. Otherwise, I frankly wouldn't particularly want to get out of bed each morning. So I hope you all agree that there are certainly better days ahead. You know, when you're taught PowerPoint skills within the private sector, you're always taught to start with an agenda slide so that you can kind of orient your audience where it is you're going to go and what you're going to talk about. Well, here's my agenda slide. I happen to like soup. I like to cook. I like stew. The reason it's an agenda slide is because there's going to be a little bit of everything that goes in. So there's going to be a lot of ingredients that go into this talk. And hopefully by the end, you'll understand that it's actually something that's worthwhile, something that's worth ingesting, if you will. There's going to be a couple of personal stories, the professional stories, a professional journey, and certainly a global story around the Sustainable Development Goals as well. A little bit about me, because I hate when people talk and you have no idea who they are. As Maddie mentioned, the things that are most important to me, my family, my wife. We don't have children. Actually, we kind of have 4 feathered children. That's Epi, Bob, Grass, and Sky that you see in the picture. Those are our birds. And I just wanted to share a quick story with you because I had the good fortune of having a whole lot of mentors throughout my career. And I spent 34 years with PepsiCo. It's the 2nd largest food and beverage company in the world, the 1st largest in New York State, first largest, sorry, in the United States. And it taught me a tremendous amount about the power of the private sector, both for good and for bad. But I had a mentor who once said to me, and this was 20 years ago, 25 years ago, he said to me, you know, if you think about some Native American tribes, there are chieftains that celebrate certain, you know, high holy days by putting on certain headdress. And there's one headdress that has a lot of feathers on it, and it actually goes like all the way down to the ground. And that's one of the quickest ways to tell that someone is the chief, is because of the number of feathers. And he used that metaphor for me early on in my career and said, if you focus on getting just an occasional feather in your cap, before you know it, without even realizing it, you've kind of ascended to the point of being chief. Now, I'm not suggesting that I'm a chief in any way, but I can tell you that that's really great career advice, because I never expected to have the opportunities that I've been given through PepsiCo to address the United Nations, to address so many different audiences around the world. And in fact, to have October 24th proclaimed Dan Bena Day in New York State, not something I ever wanted, something I ever expected. But the point is, keep your head down, stay focused on what you're passionate about in a way that will hopefully serve the greater good. And before you know it, you're just not going to believe where you are and where you end up. This is a little bit about me too. So you probably have never heard of Lost in Space, at least the original series. It was a series back in the 60s, and it was one of my favorites, and I still watch it on one of those, I don't know, antenna TVs or something. The reason this slide is here is because it's a particular episode, and it's called The Antimatter Man. And that one of the major characters was Professor John Robinson. And you probably have seen the remake of the movie of Lost in Space with the same characters. Or I think there was even a new series on Netflix. Well, this is the original. And in this episode, they were forced into what's called the antimatter world. And I thought, you know, if that's not resonant for today, right? There's so many times I wake up and I say, my God, up is down, black is white, left is right. Sometimes, and this was even before COVID, quite frankly, I didn't know which way the world was going. And whether you want to make it a political argument or a health-based argument or an economic-based argument, the predictability of the world has just dramatically decreased. And actually, there's an acronym called VUCA that some of you might have heard of, but it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that's an acronym that's used to describe the state of the world today that all of us are faced with living in. So I thought that this antimatter, you know, where left is right and up is down, was particularly appropriate. And having said that, I want to start with some group therapy. And group therapy doesn't look quite right, and it's purposely upside down as a follow-on to that kind of upside down world. Well, the beauty of group therapy is everybody starts to talk about their problems, and you start to share problems that you start to realize are common to everyone. And boy, do we have common problems as humanity. These are some slides that I took from a World Business Council for Sustainable Development report. And I'm not going to drain them. You can kind of read them on your own. But, you know, the planet certainly is facing a climate emergency. And certainly students are among probably the most engaged and the most knowledgeable and up to date in terms of the way you ingest information, whether it's about the climate crisis or about any crisis or just information in general. And the idea that the last 5 years have been the hottest since records began, it's just unbelievable. And when you look at the number of people that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change without appropriate mitigation or adaptation, mind-boggling, really mind-boggling. And it could frankly be pretty depressing. Nature's in trouble, right? It's not only climate, it's not only the earth or the planet, the physical environs of the planet, but it's certainly life on the planet. And I don't mean to, you know, understate this by going through these things quickly, because you can certainly have entire classes just on the impact on nature as a result of the mixed climate crises that we face. But when you start to think about things like, you know, 8 million tons of plastic entering the oceans annually, and that one factoid where by 2050, in your lifetimes, there could potentially be more plastic in the oceans than there are fish. You start to see these are pretty intractable challenges with which the world is faced. And unfortunately or fortunately, you know, my generation and the generation that came before me are kind of starting to peter out. You guys are the ones that are going to be charged with getting this right one way or another. So it's really important to understand and acknowledge the magnitude of these challenges and the shared obligation for the solutions to these challenges. And then people, you know, sometimes you might have heard the acronym PPP for public-private partnerships. Well, there's kind of this move within some people at the United Nations to add a fourth P, in addition to making it kind of difficult to say, right? PPPP, it stands for people-centered public-private partnerships. Because many times when you hear the kinds of factoids that I was just sharing, it's very easy to forget about the humanity part. the fact that there's a person associated with every single one of the impacts related to climate, whether they live in water scarce areas, whether they are forced to practice open defecation because they don't have access to sewers, whether they are frankly starving because of the degraded soil health that has happened over decades. So people are being left behind. And in fact, more than 700 million people are living in extreme poverty on less than $2 a day. And one of the things I loved from a few years ago is, I think at that point it was called the $1 a day challenge, where people were being challenged to try to live their lives on less than $1 a day or $2 a day or even $5 a day. I mean, if you go to Starbucks and get a cappuccino, it's probably $5 or more at this point. And when you think that that's the entire daily discretionary income that millions of people are left with, it kind of is a tremendous eye opener. So let's never forget that people are at the core of all of these solutions that we should be facing, that we should be seeking. And then this is kind of the last of the setup slides. And this is from the World Economic Forum. And every year, the World Economic Forum issues their global risk report. And guys, we're looking out for the next 10 years. And the next 10 years is when you are going to be graduating and joining the workforce. And in fact, it's when you're probably going to have the most potential within the workforce, whether you work for the private sector or the not-for-profit sector or academia. This is a pretty daunting slide when you really start to digest it, because these are the top 10 risks over the next 10 years in terms of impact. And you can see there's a lot of environmental ones, but boy, are these broad-based, ranging from climate action failure to weapons of mass destruction, to natural disasters, to cyber attacks. These are all things that, frankly, are the sad reality of the VUCA world that we live in. And I mean, I know it's no surprise and it's no news to you, but I think it's worth acknowledging that, again, this is something that you guys are going to have to face for at least the next 10 years. And there's a reason I keep saying the next 10 years, and that'll become clear, hopefully, in a couple of slides. So this was our group therapy. This was sharing the challenges and the problems that we have. And whether you even knew that you had them, now everybody is on the same page, hopefully. And we're all equally depressed and we're all equally deflated when we start to think about these unbelievable, seemingly insurmountable challenges that the world faces. So let's just all breathe a kind of a collective ugh and a collective sigh of relief, because at least now there's a lot to be said to misery loves company. And now we all know, right? Well, I've never been a pessimist. In fact, my 3 older sisters have always criticized me for being almost too painfully optimistic. So I am by nature a glass full optimist. And if I were to just think that, oh my God, these challenges are all that we have, and if I don't see solutions, I would be really depressed. And frankly, I don't think I'd want to go on every day. So I really do see hope. Is there a pathway for hope? Is there an authentic, legitimate road for hope that we are able to reach and find and implement solutions to those so many global challenges that we just talked about? I think the answer is yes. When you read the slide at the beginning, the title slide, it's about the SDGs. Is it all just talk? I can't tell you whether it's all just talk. That's a decision, obviously, that everyone has to make for themselves. I can tell you that absolutely, having spent 3 decades in the private sector and having seen a tremendous amount of negative stuff that the private sector has done, that they've been alleged to do, some of it was justified, some of it was not. I think it's a really different world. And I think the private sector is stepping up more than certainly I've ever seen in those last 30 years. So I think there is hope. And I think the major pathway to hope and solutions are the SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And to set the context for these SDGs, although hopefully you're all at least conversant in the SDGs, at least have heard about them, read about them, some probably in more detail than others, I just want to share a brief video that was produced by the United Nations. And it was released back in 2015, which is when these goals were actually ratified by 193 countries around the world. And I want you to pay careful attention, just make a mental note of how many people you kind of recognize in this video and whether or not they're government officials or whether they're from music or arts or whatever sector they might be from. So let's take a second. I think it's about 2 minutes, and bear with me, and I hope you enjoy this.
We can be.
We must be
the first generation
to end extreme poverty.
The generation
Most determined
to fight injustice
and inequalities.
The generation that saves the planet from climate change.
And this is how it will get done.
The global goals.
A 15-year plan
For everyone, everywhere.
With no one left behind.
We will live in a world
where nobody
anywhere
lives in extreme poverty.
Where no one
goes hungry.
where no one
Wakes in the morning asking if there will be food today.
We will live in a world
Where no child has to die.
Diseases we know how to cure.
And where proper health care
is a lifelong right for us all.
we will live in a world
everyone
goes to school and education gives us the knowledge
and skills
for a fulfilling life.
We will live in a world where all girls and all women have equal opportunities
to thrive
and be powerful and safe.
We cannot succeed if half the world is handicap.
We will live in a world
where all people can get clean water
and proper toilets
at home, at school, and at work.
We will live in a world where
there is sustainable energy for everyone.
heat, light,
and power for the whole planet
without destroying the planet.
We will live in a world where economies prosper and new wealth
Lead to decent jobs
for everyone.
And we will live in a world where our industry,
our infrastructure and our
best innovations
Are not just used to make money, but to make all our lives better.
we will live in a world
where prejudices and extremes of equality
Are defeated.
Inside our countries
And between different countries.
where people live in cities and communities
that are safe, progressive,
and support everyone who lives there.
Where we replace
what we consume.
Planet where we put back
What we take out of the earth.
We live in a world that is decisively rolling back
the threat of climate change.
where we restore and protect the life in our oceans and seas. We'll restore
and protect
life on land.
The forests,
Animals,
the earth itself.
with peace between and inside countries.
where all governments are open.
And answer to us for what they do at home and abroad.
and the justice rules.
With everyone equal before the law.
where all countries and we their people,
Work together.
partnerships of all kinds,
To make these goals a reality.
These are the United Nations global goals.
for sustainable development.
Let's get to work.
So, you know, guys, these are, this is an emotional video for me anyway, because to see the 17 goals linked to essentially all of the challenges and more that I started off this presentation with, but to see the number of people, and particularly the number of kids, the number of youth that are engaged and involved in solutions toward the SDGs, it has to give you hope. That's why I think this is the pathway to hope for the society that we share as humanity. And they really are a huge deal. And I just want to tell you, I've been engaged with the United Nations through PepsiCo for years. And the predecessors of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, were something called the Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs. And I have to tell you, I mean, the difference is palpable between the MDGs and the SDGs. The MDGs were very much seen as this is an agenda by government for government. And you didn't see a whole lot of non-governmental people, non-political people engaging with the MDGs. Yeah, there were some enlightened academics, there were some particularly enlightened private sector leaders, but it was nowhere near as mainstream an involvement and as inclusive a process as for the Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason I asked you to see, as you were watching this, you know, if people were familiar, there were, I mean, no more than a handful, no more than maybe 5 people who were political influencers, political leaders, or heads of state, either within the UN or at the country level. In fact, just the opposite. Virtually everyone in the video was someone that you wouldn't expect to have a particularly vested interest kind of with a political agenda or with a UN agenda. And I think that sends a really important message. So they're a huge deal. And why do I say they're a huge deal? Aside from everything that I've just said, there was a study done, and it was a report called The Transformation for Growth. And they likened the sustainable development revolution, the sustainability revolution, as likely being the most significant event in economic history, more so than the Green Revolution, more so than the Industrial Revolution. When you think of the historical context and the historical importance of this, it is mind-boggling, to say the least. So how we doing against the goals? I mean, there was a guy who, I think it was back in the 70s, he was the mayor of New York City, Ed Koch, and you should Google him because I don't think you'll see a clip of him without saying, how we doing? And he would always ask that to his constituents. And now I don't want you to give the impression that I was an adult in the 70s, because I wasn't. I was like 12 or 13. But I remember seeing Mayor Koch on television, and he would always say, how we doing? How am I doing? Well, this is how we're doing with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals. This was a report that was issued by the United Nations Secretary General. And an excerpt from the report, right? The shift required to meet our goals by 2030. Again, there's that 10-year. I said over the next 10 years. So we have 10 years to meet these SDGs, is not yet advancing at the speed or the scale required. Furthermore, the United Nations Secretary General said this: it's cause for great concern that the extreme poverty rate is projected to be 6% in 2030. Hunger's on the rise. Biodiversity is being lost at an alarming rate. There's a factoid that you saw on a previous slide, 1 million species already facing extinction. Greenhouse gas emissions, right? There's just not strong enough power and reach in the institutions that have traditionally been looked at to solve these kinds of intractable challenges. So what do? Well, I mean, this is the Secretary General of the UN saying, basically, we need help. The UN isn't even able to do this on our own. Heads of state aren't able to do this on their own. So you look to other actors, you look to the private sector and academia, and you look to the not-for-profit world, and you look to individual citizens that can play a role in helping to move toward achievement of the SDGs. Business, thankfully, is being recognized as helping. Now, with the MDGs, there was still a tremendous amount of anti-private sector sentiment. With the SDGs, and again, nothing is perfect, but with the SDGs, the private sector is being seen as a much more legitimate, authentic way to kind of work with governments and other players to achieve these SDGs. Just yesterday, I saw there was a newsletter from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development that went out, and they were sharing something like 150 discrete examples of businesses that were acting in response to COVID. And they weren't acting for profit, and they weren't acting explicitly for reputation, although hopefully that will be one of the knock-on effects of doing these things. They were acting because they realized that business cannot succeed in a society that fails. And that was a quote from one of the former presidents of the WBCSD. Think about that. Business cannot succeed in a society that fails. Absolutely true. And I think it's the enlightened business leaders that understand that. This was a report from USAID. It's an arm of the federal government, particularly involved with development aid. And in that report, they explicitly recognize the help of the private sector. How does the private sector help with these broader societal challenges? Well, first responders after a natural disaster. Look at this stuff. I mean, it's been a nightmare in terms of the N95 masks for COVID and the ventilators. But in the end, the private sector is in fact stepping up to the challenge. So they're the first responders. In fact, because so many multinationals are so widely spread across the country, the world, they actually are in some ways a better place, a better position to respond to crises than even potentially some governments are. And what do I mean by that? When you think of just PepsiCo, right, my former employer, PepsiCo served consumers in more countries and territories than the United Nations had members. That's unbelievable when you really think about that, right? That's a tremendous amount of reach. And if companies are able to put that reach to good, all the better. And that's when you start to move toward that pathway to hope, creating jobs, developing innovation. My God, private sector partnerships with academia, that's where innovation comes from. That's where so much innovation is incubated and proven. And then providing, obviously, critical goods and services. So that's kind of an outside look of why business should be recognized as helping with the SDGs. But what about an inside look? What's in it for business? Why should business say, you know what, there's these things called the SDGs and they're great and I'm shaking my head in agreement that, yeah, they're important, but what does it actually mean for business? Is there a legitimate route with which business can engage? Well, this was a report called Corporate Disruptors. It was done by Accenture, and it was specifically looking at the compelling business case for companies, for the private sector, to engage materially in the Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see, I mean, it's a pretty big report, but it distills down to ultimately growing revenue through new products and services, building brand reputation, mitigating risks, perhaps the most notable of which is license to operate and grow. You know, when a company loses their social license to operate, which is granted at the will and at the pleasure of the communities they serve, it's not their investors, it's not other stakeholders, they get their license to operate and grow from communities. So if you screw up that contract, you're going to either lose market share, you're going to go out of business, you're going to get bad reputations. So that is one of the biggest risks that companies, certainly enlightened companies, understand that they need to manage, is this social contract. And then ultimately reducing costs. And the easiest way is when you look at the water efficiency target for SDG 6 around water, certainly if you save water, by and large, you're going to save money. Look at the climate goal, right? Renewable energy. If you save energy, you're probably going to save money at some point, at least initially on in the process. So reducing costs is another certainly reason for companies to engage. There was a study done a few years ago, and this was pretty compelling because they identified a market, and companies love to talk about market-based approaches and what are the markets, what are the market opportunities. Well, they identified $12 trillion a year in business value across these 4 economic systems by 2030. So achievement or approaching the SDGs and the development of new markets as a result of that and on the way to that achievement of the SDGs can unleash $12 trillion a year in new market opportunities. And oh, by the way, at a time when unprecedented people because of COVID are applying for unemployment, the SDGs can create more than 380 million incremental jobs. And as if that's not enough, I mean, I've mentioned the World Business Council for Sustainable Development a couple of times, and they surveyed all of their members. And to become a member of WBCSD, it's got to be a commitment by the CEO of the company. So it's not that just an employee can do it. The CEO has got to signal commitment to what the WBCSD is trying to do, which is essentially advance sustainable development pinned to the Sustainable Development Goals. And look at what their members said. I mean, in this case, the dark blue and sort of the seafoam color next to it really are the important combinations to look at. But they're saying that it's an opportunity to better focus our corporate sustainability strategies. It's an opportunity, essentially a license or permission to innovate, tremendous reputational gains and license to operate. All of these things are the benefits, and pretty significant benefits, at least in the eyes of these hundreds of CEOs, that participating with governments and other players in the SDGs will reap. And then lastly, this was an interesting one because as we start to bring all of these story pieces together, remember the soup that I started with on the agenda, we see the intractable challenges. We see the fact that people and players beyond governments, right, actors and actresses and musicians and individuals are interested in participating. We're starting to see through the external lens and the internal lens why business should be interested, and in fact, increasingly, why businesses are interested in the Sustainable Development Goals. And then this report by EY, formerly Ernst & Young, talked specifically about purpose-led brands. And this was one of the first times that I saw corporate purpose explicitly linked to achievement to one or more of the SDGs, and in so doing, generating long-term value. Now, all of this stuff comes together. And to me, I'm a sustainable development practitioner. So I'm biased, and I'm an optimist, so I'm biased. I think everything that we've just discussed is a remarkably compelling case for anybody to care about the SDGs and learn about the SDGs and try to work with others to achieve the SDGs. But not everybody believes that. And I mean, just look at the news, right? Not everybody thinks the same way. And sometimes I marvel at some of the ways people do think. I mean, human psychology and I suppose mental illness is kind of remarkable things, because that's the only way I can describe some of the things that we've been seeing going on, certainly in the media today. But having said all of that, no matter how compelling the case is on data and on science, if all else fails, there's a guy, former president, Theodore Roosevelt, who said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," right? You might have heard that quote. I've heard it a lot of times in many different applications, both professionally and personally. He was a pretty remarkable guy in a lot of ways, but this quote is very much associated with him. And when you talk about the big stick for the private sector, particularly for large companies, particularly for publicly held companies, that big stick is the investment community. And there's a guy named Larry Fink, who is the CEO of the world's largest investment company called BlackRock. They manage, as of their last report, almost $8 trillion in assets under management. So you talk about a big stick. When he sends a letter to hundreds of CEOs in which they either invest or in which they are thinking of investing, or worse, in which they are thinking of divesting, you can bet that the CEO and his and her entire senior team takes note. And you can see this is pretty remarkable, that a guy in charge of almost $8 trillion in assets under management is using language like purpose, corporate purpose, right? They're saying that to achieve long-term profits, you have to authentically embrace corporate purpose. And remember the EY report that we just saw that linked corporate purpose with the SDGs. So I told you there was going to be kind of stories that were coming through this. And I happen to think that the SDGs is probably the most elegant and comprehensive framework, certainly that I've ever seen, against which companies can build a corporate purpose strategy. And now a final thought, and we talked a lot about companies in the private sector and how they're viewed as being legitimate, authentic participants or partners in the achievement of the SDGs. I want to talk for a second specifically about brands. Brands, PepsiCo has about 3,000 brands across the world. Every single day, think about this, over 1 billion people eat or drink a PepsiCo product. And that's just one company. So if you think of Coca-Cola and Unilever and Patagonia and all of these companies put together that manage brands and manage brand reputation, it's a pretty remarkable opportunity to use the power of those brands for good. And I think, I mentioned kind of some personal stories, and as I've gotten older and as I've matured within my professional life, I've gotten a lot more introspective and maybe a lot more philosophical. And I really do start to think more about this idea that we are all one human tribe, whether, irrespective of your gender or your sexual preference or where you come from or your religion, we are one human tribe. And no one else can say that. No other thing can say that. And the reason this study was so really impressive to me was they went up to maybe the 100,000 foot level. And there's a ton of studies that get very granular, and they stratify different consumer groups, and they look at what, white males 18 to 25 eat and drink and what they like to do when they shop. This kind of did the opposite. And I thought it was really intriguing because they asked 16,000 people across 16 countries what it is that's important to them. And they didn't really ask so much about brands. They asked, what's important to you? And it was really elegant because they distilled down what those 16,000 people said. And I should note that those 16 countries were both developed and developing world countries. So it was a pretty nice cross-section. people want four things. And I defy you to shake your head in disagreement with this, because everybody wants to be healthy, right? And a reasonable amount of well-being. Everybody might not want to be rich, traditionally rich. You want financial security. You want to be able to provide for you, your family, your friends. You want meaningful relationships. And again, there's that word purpose. They want a sense of purpose. People want a reason to get up in the morning. They want a reason to believe. And again, I sound like a broken record, but I think the SDGs are a remarkable reason to believe. Go back and watch that video again once this is over. There's a ton of information in that video when they start going through the 17 goals, and there is literally something for everyone. If you care about anything, whether it's education or gender equity or water stewardship or poverty or hunger, there's a goal for that. And even if you don't explicitly care about those things, but say, I really care about partnerships and bringing people together, there's even an explicit goal, 17, for partnerships. And it's how do you form the right partnerships between academia and governments and the private sector and individuals, and how do you make them work? I don't mean to get onto a pulpit, but this is really important because it gets back to my PPPP, people-centered public-private partnerships. Let's never forget this human perspective. And if a company is able to make profit as a result of fulfilling these, great. But what they really should do is fill this brand purpose gap that was identified as part of this study. And what do I mean by brand purpose gap? Well, they asked those 16,000 people, is it important to support companies with a purpose? And 65% of them across developed and developing economies said, sure, of course we want to support companies with a strong purpose. And then they asked those same people, and this is abysmal, can you name just one company that makes a positive difference in society? So you're telling me that companies with purpose are important and I want to support them. Just name one company that has a purpose. And only 45% of those people could name a single company. So that's what led to what we're calling the 20% brand purpose gap. That's a tremendous opportunity for companies to fill. And if they can fill that gap in the same way as filling and helping to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, to me, that's kind of nirvana. And what do you get when you do that? Well, when you fill that gap, consumers reward you. And more consumers are not saying that they'll support companies that have a purpose, whether it's a social or an environmental purpose, but they actually are putting their money where their mouth is, and they're buying from companies that prove that in an authentic way. And the other side of the coin is, boy, are they speaking with their consumer voice and punishing companies that don't show that purpose, or that are greenwashing or blue washing or brown washing. So this brand purpose gap is remarkable. And there's 4 steps to fill it. And this is going to sound, there's a comedian, Steve Martin, who back in the 70s was on Saturday Night Live. And I'll never forget, he came up and he did his first stand-up act. And he said, I'm going to tell you the simplest way to make $1 million. And that now it would be like $1 billion or $1 trillion. But back then it was $1 million. And he stood up at the microphone and he said, first, get $1 million. So he kind of poo-pooed the idea that, yeah, you can get $1 million, but you have to just find it somewhere. And then that's the easiest part. So he minimized, obviously, what making $1 million meant. I don't mean to do the same with this, but there's a ton of compelling information in these 4 steps. If a company starts with empathy, people at the center, if they define their North Star, which is purpose beyond product. So again, anchor it in something that's more important than your individual company or your individual people, your individual desires. Take a stand. You probably have seen a ton of reports, brands taking stands. Increasingly, the expectations of CEOs are to take stands on issues that matter. What better thing to take stands on than the SDGs? And then start a movement. Remember I said 1 billion people eat or drink a Pepsi product every single day? If PepsiCo is able to mobilize those armies of consumers toward a movement, toward any one of the SDGs, my God, that's 1 billion people a day working toward the greater good. Pretty remarkable. And I just want to end, believe it or not, end with this quote. And this is from that same report. And I'm not going to read all of it, but it basically ends on a hopeful note. if we remember that brands are built by humans for humans, and it also links that we feel the same pain, we want those same four things. We are, in fact, one tribe called humanity. And whether you work for a company or the UN or a local government or academia or a not-for-profit, just remember that we're all part of the same human tribe and that we want those same things. And let's work together to do that. And in the end, you know, people say that he never shuts up about the SDGs, and my wife hates this slide because she doesn't like to think about me dying, and she said, please take that one out. But I think that's the only way I'm going to stop advocating for the SDGs is A, if we meet them by 2030, and I'm fortunate enough to still be around, or B, if I die in advance of it, that's probably going to shut me up, although I'll probably come back and haunt a heck of a lot of people about the SDGs. So with that, I want to end with this same photograph of hope, that there is a better day ahead. There are these golden or silver linings to the clouds, and thank everybody for your time. And I'm happy, Maddie, to take some questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dan. And I have to say, I love that last slide. Even if your wife hates it, I got a good laugh out of it. So
thank you. Thank you.
So our first question, it's a pretty lengthy one, so bear with me.
Sure.
But it says, are there any additional membership, annual, etc. requirements for the WBCSD besides the CEO's commitment? Or once the company is a member, do they simply stay in and reap the benefits of being considered a sustainable company and boosting their brand?
Yep. So there are, I mean, there's a ton of commitments. One of them is that you are expected to engage through your company in one or more of the work streams. And there's a ton of work streams. When I was with PepsiCo, I was their corporate water steward. I was very involved in the stuff around water and sanitation and hygiene. And in addition, there are, again, depending on the work stream, there are other commitments that CEOs are given the flexibility to commit and endorse or not, based on whether or not it makes sense for their business. One of them in particular that I remember that I was pretty instrumental in helping to form is the Wash in the Workplace pledge. And you know, there's a story with that, Maddie, because it's remarkable. You know, I thought I was with PepsiCo for so long, and I kind of believed that we were by and large a pretty good company, and we were doing the right things. And then when this Wash in the Workplace pledge came along, and the CEO had to commit in an auditable way that all of your employees at your direct manufacturing facilities had adequate access to wash, you know, water, sanitation, and hygiene, which means, you know, hot water, water of a specific temperature, soap to be able to adequately wash your hands, toilets, you know, that were enough for the people that you had. And then we started to find out that, you know what, when you start to audit these things and start to peel away and look much more closely, there were even some opportunities for a great company like PepsiCo to improve before they were able to authentically sign and endorse that WASH pledge. So I would say, you know, the kind of longish answer is it depends on what's core to the company, what their strategy is, but you can find a ton of different ways that you're expected to commit and engage through the WBCSD. I also will say that WBCSD was ranked for several years in a row as one of the most kind of revered, if you will, or most authentic NGOs because of the way that they approach things and because of the advocacy and the expectations that they expect of the CEO members.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question is, which company or companies in particular have you read about, researched, or experienced recently that you believe have a solid grasp on their overall purpose, and what would you say that purpose is?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would be foolish not to start with the one that I worked for 34 years. PepsiCo, you know, I believe, in fact, the former CEO of PepsiCo, a remarkable woman named Indra Nooyi, she started something called Performance with Purpose back, I think it was maybe her first or second year as CEO back in like 2009 or 10. And she started this thing called Performance with Purpose, which kind of hinted that the company, because we have a responsibility to our shareholders as well as to stakeholders, the company can continue to make profit, that is the performance part, but to do so with purpose. And I can tell you, I mean, having had tremendous visibility and support from Ms. Nooyi, I can tell you that she's the real deal. And many CEOs are the real deal. It may not come across as legitimate and authentic, either in the way they speak or what they do, but having engaged with them personally for years, I can tell you that they are. And the real frustration comes when you're unable to effectively communicate that legitimacy. And then there's a lot of reasons for that. And it's, communication is not an easy thing. It's a little bit more of an art than a science. But PepsiCo certainly is one of them. And one of the things that Ms. Nui continually said was, she wants to make sure that anytime PepsiCo goes out publicly and sets a public goal, a public target, makes a public statement, she was resolute that we were able to back that up, not with just, one or two stories, but with numbers, with hard data, with facts. And that went a long way. And now that made it a little bit difficult in some ways, because we were perhaps behind some other companies that would go out maybe with the story first and then kind of worry about backing it up later, or kind of doing it as they went along. PepsiCo wasn't like that. So PepsiCo is one. I mean, the standard, I would say, of companies with purpose certainly is Patagonia. I just look up the things that Patagonia is doing. They were doing it way before it became kind of mainstream. But I would suggest to the person that's asking, there are so many rating systems now that actually rate companies on ethics and on purpose and on environmental stewardship. And whether it's the DJSI, the Robeco SAM is kind of one of the better known ones, whether it's Corporate Knights, whether it's Ethical Corporation, there are a ton of companies across all different sectors that are objectively rated based on what they report in the public domain, and in some cases, follow-up conversations that people have with the CEOs themselves.
Awesome, thank you. So I encourage everyone to keep sending in questions, whether that be chat, or you can do the raise hand function and I can call on you and unmute your video, that kind of thing if you'd like. But I do have a question for you myself of, do you have a favorite SDG? And if so, why is it that way?
Yeah, Maddie, so I didn't spend too much time talking about my background, but I was the corporate water steward for PepsiCo. And when I first started, I was identified for a training program. I actually started as a biochemist in the lab, and I was painfully shy. I was a pathologic introvert, never wanted to leave the lab, never wanted to speak publicly, never frankly wanted to even leave the lab to go get coffee, because God forbid I would have to meet someone. And then that proverbial spark lit. And to me, the spark was around water. And it was the bigger picture of not only designing water treatment systems, which is what I was doing for PepsiCo for quite a while, but when you start to look through an external lens and you see 785 million people lacking an improved drinking water source, or in fact, depending on how you identify things, 2.1 billion people with a B today not having access to safely managed water, drinking water. 2.1 billion people in a global population of 7.4, 7.5 billion. That's remarkable. And it's a shame, and it's abysmal, and it's disgusting, but that's the reality. So I would say, as the corporate water steward, as somebody that has really become an advocate of water as a human right before the UN even formally ratified that, I would say SDG 6 is my baby. Now, the other reason I like it, because you said why, when we talk about systems approaches to things, and you start to look at, I always think the most exciting stuff is in the interconnectivity between things, right? It's not any one goal. It's not any one public statement. It's not any one person. It's the way people interact with each other and whether that's successful or not. It's the way the SDGs interconnect with each other and whether that's successful or not. And when you look at SDG 6 around water, you're not going to reach SDG 1, which is ending poverty, if you don't get water right. You're not going to reach SDG 2, which is about food insecurity with agriculture, if you don't get water right. You're not going to get gender equality right. You're not going to get education right, because women and girls are not allowed to go to school in many of the developing world because they're going to fetch water. So, I mean, it's just when you talk about so many SDGs that can be impacted positively just by getting SDG 6 right with water, sanitation, hygiene, and watershed management, it's pretty compelling to me.
That was a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
And our next question is, do you have any career advice in this area of like sustainability or how to get into this area?
Oh my God, I have so much career advice. People are usually sick of hearing me
Let's
talk
hear
about it.
it.
So I've had the good fortune of speaking at Penn State a couple of times, and when I have in the past, actually in person, I usually ask, do you want to just stick to the topic, or do you want to spend 20 minutes or a half hour on career advice? And I always give career advice, and that's usually they would, in retrospect, rather I spoke all about career advice than the specific topic. But if I can kind of distill down some lessons, right? One is, and this is very tactical and very tangible, use LinkedIn and use LinkedIn as effectively as you possibly can. There was a study a while ago that said as high as 94% of positions in the United States are gotten as a result of a first or second degree connection on LinkedIn. So getting your LinkedIn profile is absolutely critical. Having said that, it's not just merely a cut and paste of your paper resume and putting it on there. You have to creatively use videos. You have to creatively use links and all of the widgets that LinkedIn allows you to use. And this is really important. And it gets back to communication. Use the LinkedIn posting of articles to let prospective employers or prospective partners or academic institutions, if you want to go, the route of academia, to let people know that number one, you have a passion for a cause. And number two, and this is a really important caveat, that you are able to articulate that passion in a way that doesn't isolate or in an adversarial way. That's what people want. Activism is great, and activism has gotten a lot of stuff done. But the reality is, the natural world kind of moderates somewhere to the center, right? So I always, I tell this story, and I have 3 older sisters, and one of them is an avid activist. And she cares so much about environment and so much about the world, to the point where she just gets so flustered when she tries to articulate that passion. And I said to her, unless you can learn to articulate and communicate effectively, people are going to look at you as somebody who's crazy, and they're not going to hear what it is you're trying to say. So I would say take courses in communication, effective communication, ways to public speak, because no matter what, being an effective public speaker and learning how to hook audiences, engage and inspire them, and make them, an advocate for whatever it is you're trying to suggest is really important. And then the last thing I'll say is, when you go on interviews, and this is, I'm kind of big on quotes, and I've shared this one quote with my 4 nephews and nieces throughout their careers: be confident, not certain. And what I mean by that is, when you sit across the table from me, and particularly people, and don't take this the wrong way, and I'm not painting with a broad brush, it's based exclusively on my interactions and my experiences, people of your generation and even the generation before tend to come into an interview with a tremendous amount of bravado and a tremendous amount of certainty that they're the best for the job, and they're going to let the interviewer know why they're the best for the job. And I got news for you, that's a huge turnoff to people of my generation, who frankly are still the ones that are going to be doing a lot of the hiring of your generation. So when I say be confident, not certain, confidence is a good thing as long as it's not too far in one direction. But don't go in being certain that what you're about to say is in fact the only way to say it, or the only way to approach it. And the worst thing somebody can do is come in and sit down and start to say, okay, this is the value I'm going to add to your organization. It gets back to this humanity piece, Maddie. For God's sake, if you go in and sit down with a friend, probably the first thing you're going to say is, oh, say, what'd you do yesterday? What'd you do last night? You're going to ask something that's a little bit personal to show that there's this bond between person to person. Do that on an interview. When you go in and sit down, if you see a really interesting piece of artwork on the wall, or a little kind of a tchotchke that's on a credenza somewhere, ask the interviewer, I've been noticing that that's really cool. That's a really neat bronze elephant. Is there a story behind that? Because it shows so much more than any of the stuff that you've put in your LinkedIn profile or your resume, or any of the stuff, frankly, that you've been able to learn through formal coursework. It shows that you're able to apply the stuff that you've learned.
That's really great advice. Thank you. And I do want to plug that he did put his LinkedIn up there, so if anyone wants to connect with him, feel free.
Please.
Yeah. Are there any more questions? I think I was able to catch all the ones that are in there already. But if you have any more, feel free to raise your hand or throw
And
it.
Maddie, just so everybody knows, I'm, for better or for worse, I'm ridiculously approachable and reachable. And, sometimes it's why I'm up till 2 a.m. because I tend to be kind of obsessed with email and texts, and certainly I'm obsessed with LinkedIn. But I really believe that people who have been mentored successfully have an obligation to mentor others. So I really like to do that. And if there is a specific question about career advice, or if you have a question that comes up after you digest some of the stuff that we've talked about today, I would encourage you, please do reach out either to the email or via LinkedIn. I'm not saying that I'll answer everyone, but I'll certainly try. And I had a great example because Indra Nooyi, that CEO that I spoke about, I'll tell you, for being the CEO of a $66 billion company that does business in more countries and territories than the UN, she taught all of us a remarkable lesson, which is treat people with respect. And part of treating people with respect is you don't ignore them. And you may not agree with what they say, and you may not enjoy answering them, but if you can answer them, at least to say, that's a stupid idea, I don't like that, or of course, let's set up some time to talk. I mean, again, it goes back to that human interaction. And I think if everybody could start to do a little bit more of that, COVID or not, the world will ultimately be a better place.
Wonderful. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions, but Dan can stick around for a few minutes. So if anyone has any additional questions, he can answer them still via Zoom. So with that being said, thank you so much, Dan, for coming today and talking. I know we've had a hectic past few days trying to figure everything out, but I really appreciate your flexibility and willingness to accommodate the situation.
Thanks, Maddie. And thanks, Dr. Goodstein, for this. I love this stuff. And even if there's one kernel of wisdom that came out, I forget the actual quote, so I'm going to really tremendously, horribly misquote this, but it's something to the effect of, don't for a moment think that one person can't change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. And that was really anchoring to me because, it's amazing how one person with passion, people understand passion and they somehow feel it, it becomes palpable, and they want to associate with that. They want to associate with positive energy and passion for a cause. And even if it's a cause that's really hard to solve, people come around and they say, you know what, I'd like to be part of this. I'd like to be part of this. Remember those 4 steps. The last one was start a movement, start a campaign. I think the first step of that is passion for a cause, being able to articulate that cause, but most importantly, coming across as being legitimate. The worst thing in the world you can do is try to pull the wool over anybody's eyes, because people know that immediately. So I would say that, the power of the individual, both individually and collectively, is astounding.
Thank you. You're so wise, Dan.
I don't know.
Perfect. We will be having another showcase this Friday at noon, featuring Mark Brennan. So he is a Penn State faculty member.
I love him.
You know him.
So Professor Brennan is one of 3 global youth chairs for UNESCO, and he is a remarkable guy.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad that you are praising him as well. But he will be talking about kind of the youth movement within climate and the SDGs as well. So that will be an exciting talk, and I hope you are able to join us for that. Otherwise, if you aren't on the newsletter and would like to be, feel free to message me your email and I would be happy to add you. And then Dan can stick around for a few minutes. So thank you and have a good Monday.
Thanks, Maddie.
Yeah.